Chapter the 7th, War. Gnomes were ranged in serried ranks, hundreds of them, armed each with pickaxe, hammer, or spade. They stood quite silent in the vast cavern, as if they were part of the rocks. The prince caught sight of Reimer and Grimjaw and came hurrying over. "It has begun," he said. "The gnomes will not fight above ground, but they will help. They are planning a small earthquake to breach the castle wall. The Duke will have to come out to meet my army." "How is that possible?" Reimer asked. "I thought the passes were still closed by snow. How can you move an army up here, assuming you have one?" "There's more than one way to move an army. There are tunnels and caverns throughout the earth. The gnomes know the way. My army will be here tomorrow morning." Grimjaw cleared his throat. "No doubt your men are brave, my lord, but the Duke still has his magic, by which he may inspire terror in any human being." "Ah, yes," the prince gave a wink. "In any human being." And with that, he turned away on some urgent business. In the next hours, Reimer had little to do. Gnomes scurried about in the caverns on mysterious errands. Grimjaw and the prince were both off somewhere busy with their own tasks, whatever they might be. Reimer found a dark cubicle and lay down to rest. It was late at night. He had no idea what hour. He could see no point in scurrying about. He thought again of Ariella and whether he would ever lay eyes on her again. His lute and his music were more important still to him than the castle or any wars. He began to compose a song in his head about marching gnomes and knights, and doing so, fell sound asleep. "There you are." He was awakened by a rough hand shaking him. It was Grimjaw's voice. "It's time for the war. We'll need it, Buff." Rubbing sleep from his eyes, Reimer wished for a cup of hot tea. "What do you need me for?" he started to ask, but there was no time, apparently, for an answer. Grimjaw hurried him into a long, dark tunnel. The passage seemed to go on for miles. Though he was not tall, even Reimer had to stoop to avoid banging his head on rock. There was no light except Grimjaw's torch, and clammy water dripped on their heads. Reimer finally noticed that Grimjaw was fully armed and wearing chainmail. Finally, the tunnel began to slope upward. They climbed a long way, and a faint light began to show ahead. Just then, there was another earthquake, accompanied by a far-off rumbling sound. They both staggered. Grimjaw said, "That will be the castle wall coming down, just as the gnomes promised. Our timing is perfect." Then the tunnel opened out into a narrow cave, and they stepped down into open air. They found themselves in a broad field outside the walls. Snow covered the ground as far as the eye could see, except for the castle itself. Castle Stark sat black and barren at the end of a long causeway with sheer cliffs on each side. At first, Reimer could see no difference. Then he realized there was a gaping hole where the main gate had been. A pile of rubble lay at the bottom of the wall, and men were scrambling over it like ants. It was first light, with the sun not even above the mountains yet. Reimer shivered in the cold, wishing for breakfast. "The gnomes have done the job," Prince Joseph commented. Reimer looked around. There was only the prince, Grimjaw, and himself. "Where's the army?" he asked. "On the way. Have no fear. Before we have a battle, we must challenge the Black Duke to single combat." "Of course, single combat." Reimer wanted to go back to bed. Grimjaw handed him something white. "What's that?" It was some kind of cloth. "Flag of truce," Grimjaw said. "On this scroll, with the prince's challenge written out formally." "Oh." Reimer stared blankly at them. "Well, get a move on. We don't have all day." Reimer coughed. What? You mean you want me to? Well, someone has to do it. I can't because I'm the prince's champion. I'm supposed to fight the Duke. Just walk halfway out to the castle and hand the scroll to whoever meets you there. But don't worry, the Duke will respect a flag of truce, deceitful as he is. He has nothing to lose. Just deliver the scroll and come right back. We'll be waiting. Reimer could see it was no use arguing. He sighed, shrugged his shoulders, and started off, holding the white flag up high. He hoped they would be able to see it against the snow. He walked halfway down the causeway and stood there waiting. It seemed to take a long time for the Duke's men to notice him standing there. Reimer shivered, waiting. Another minute or two, he decided, and he'd give up and go back. He wasn't going any closer to the Duke if he could help it. Finally, just when he was about to turn and leave, he noticed a figure on a horse emerge from the gap in the castle wall. It was a man in black armor riding a black horse with a white flag fluttering from his helm. The horse proceeded at a stately pace, in no hurry. Apparently, it was one of those show horses, trained in fancy steps and prancing. The rider took his time, making the animal step high and march. In due course, the horseman drew up and looked down at Reimer. Well, if it isn't the worm, Sir Blackthorn said. Reimer handed up the scroll. It says, Reimer recited, that Prince Joseph, the rightful ruler of Castle Stark, challenges the usurper to single combat with the prince's champion. Blackthorn sneered and stuck the scroll in his belt. You may think you've got away, Blackthorn said, but I'm coming after you when this is over with, when the Duke has thrashed both the prince and his champion. I plan to skin you alive, slowly, and hang your hide from the castle walls. The rest of you I'll feed to the dogs. That did it. Even Reimer had his limits to patience. He'd not had enough sleep. He'd had no breakfast. He was cold, and he didn't even want to be here. He looked up at Blackthorn's sneering face above the fine horse. Twaddle, Reimer said. Blackthorn's face began to redden. What? What did you say to me? I said, Reimer repeated, twaddle. Pish, tush, and twaddle. And with that, he seized the knight's left foot with both hands and heaved upward as hard as he possibly could. Sir Blackthorn toppled off the other side of his horse and crashed to the ground. When a knight in full armor crashes to the ground, it is not easy for him to rise. Sir Blackthorn was wearing about 100 pounds of steel. Reimer mounted the horse. He turned back toward the field where the prince and Grimjaw waited. Be sure to give the Duke his letter, Reimer said. Swine! Sir Blackthorn screamed from the ground. You're all swine! When Reimer got back, he handed the reins to Grimjaw. If you're going to fight the Duke, he said, you should have a horse. Reimer stood on a little hill next to Prince Joseph, looking down across the field which lay between them and Castle Stark. Though the sky was clear and blue, Reimer shivered in the chill. Below them, the Black Duke faced Sir Grimjaw for the second time in both their lives. The first time had been a mere contest, a game at which the Duke had cheated. Now it was a duel to the death. For long minutes, the Duke and Grimjaw sat motionless on their horses, as if waiting for some signal. The Duke wore black, heavy armor from head to foot, a shield on his left arm and lance at his right. Grimjaw wore only mail and light armor and carried no shield. An uneven match, Reimer thought. I can feel the fear, Prince Joseph whispered. Can you not feel it also? It is like waves of terror flowing from the Duke. I don't know how Grimjaw can stay there without turning in panic and running for his life. A brave man, Reimer said. Only a man of courage can go ahead in spite of fear. He's not like me. If I were afraid, I would run. But you're never afraid, Reimer shrugged. That's what I mean. Suddenly, Grimjaw and the Duke spurred their horses and exploded into motion in the same moment. In the distance, the Duke's men could be heard raising their voices in a loud huzzah. The two horses galloped toward each other in the snow, each sending up a white cloud behind, hooves pounding and the breath from their nostrils issuing bellows of steam. Both gathered speed, thudding and pounding faster and faster, rushing towards certain collision. The Duke's lance came down, pointing directly at Grimjaw, whose lance followed. Reimer expected a terrible crash, but nothing happened, except that Grimjaw's horse turned at the last moment and galloped away, evading the Duke's charge. Lost his nerve, Joseph muttered, but then who can blame him? And yet Grimjaw reined to a stop and wheeled. The Duke did likewise. The Duke gave a cackling laugh and charged again. This time Grimjaw did something Reimer had never heard of. Instead of spurring his horse to charge, he gave it some unheard command so that it spread out and braced all four legs, facing the Duke's charge without moving from the spot. Both lances came down. The Duke continued his charge, but the unexpected tactic must have confused him, for his horse slowed just before impact. What happened next was too quick for Reimer's eyes to follow. Grimjaw's lance made a sudden twisting motion, so that the Duke's weapon slid past harmlessly. Yet the Duke himself thudded into the side of Grimjaw's lance. There was a sickening crash as the Duke spun from his horse to the hard ground. Still, the Duke was not finished. He rolled and lay still a moment. Yet by the time Grimjaw had dismounted, the Duke was clambering to his feet. Reimer stole a glance at the castle. The Duke's lackeys were still arrayed in battle formation before the gate, waiting and watching. The Duke drew his sword, and Grimjaw his two-handed battle axe. The next few moments were a flash and ringing of steel. Sparks flew. Grimjaw fell back. Then the Duke retreated. Reimer wondered how long either could keep up this furious pace. Then the Duke's sword made a sudden sweep sideways and connected with Grimjaw's weapon, shattering the handle. The Duke laughed again. He waved his sword 3 times in the air and moved in for a kill. Grimjaw was unarmed. But then, as the Duke raised his sword above his head, Grimjaw drew a small object from his belt. From this distance, Reimer could make out what it was, the tiny hatchet which the wizard had made from his dragon's scale. A dragon's scale is the hardest and sharpest object on earth. The Duke slashed downward at Grimjaw's head. Grimjaw stepped to the side and met the powerful sword with the edge of his tiny hatchet. The Duke's sword broke in 2 clean pieces. Then Grimjaw stepped forward. He slashed at the Duke, downward and to the side. The Duke's armor plate split like an eggshell and fell to the ground. This time, Grimjaw gave a laugh. He danced around the Duke, slashing and cutting. He drew not a drop of blood, but in moments the Duke's black armor lay all on the ground in shiny pieces. Grimjaw yanked off the Duke's black helmet. The Duke stood naked in the snow, except for the thin undergarments he wore beneath the armor. Even his underwear is black, Prince Joseph noted. What might have happened next would be anyone's guess, except that the Duke, instead of yielding to Grimjaw's mercy as would have been proper, suddenly gave a scream, turned, and began running back to the castle, waving his arms and yelling, "To arms! To arms! Attack! Attack!" "The Duke is no gentleman," commented Prince Joseph. Reimer watched as the Duke ran back toward his own men. Grimjaw shrugged and came back up the hill in no hurry. I defeated the Duke in single combat, he commented as he returned. That's what matters. Reimer grew nervous as he watched the Duke's men by the castle gate. He could not see where the Duke was, but his men drew themselves up in battle array, horsemen to the front, and began to march directly toward the hill where the prince stood. Your Highness, Reimer inquired, looking around. You said something about an army? The Duke's drummers began to play as his troops marched toward them. Boom, diddy, boom, 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 diddy, boom, boom. The racket became ear-splitting. So I did, Joseph said. He turned and looked back toward a large boulder near the hillside in back of them, about 100 feet from the cave entrance they had come out of. Reimer noticed the boulder blocked the view of a small tunnel entrance. Prince Joseph raised his hand and waved once. From behind the boulder stepped two figures, both of whom Reimer could not help but recognize. He would have recognized the girl by odor alone, with his eyes closed. The other was twice as tall as anyone else he'd ever seen. Striding down the hill came Swinegirl and the giantess Gorinda. The girl carried a staff in one hand and Gorinda a huge rolling pin. That's your army, Reimer said. When does the battle start? Gorinda demanded, in a voice that could be heard above the Duke's drum rolls. Joseph bowed and took the hand of Swinegirl. He turned to Reimer and Grimjaw. Delighted you could join us, my dear. These are my two heroic friends. May I present Sir Grimjaw and Reimer, whom you already know, and this is my sister, Josephina. Reimer could think of nothing to say. For perhaps the first time in his life, words failed him. He felt his face turning bright red. Thank you for freeing my brother from the castle dungeon, Swinegirl said, smiling. You're welcome, Reimer got out at last. Grimjaw bowed and kissed the lady's hand. You are the most beautiful princess I've ever seen, he said. When does the battle start? Gorinda demanded, swinging her rolling pin. Reimer glanced around, startled back to the present situation, which was becoming rapidly urgent. The Duke's army was almost across the field below, near the bottom of the hillside. He guessed there were about 400 men, including about 40 men on horseback. The drum major rode in the front rank, astride a great black charger. He was dressed head to foot in black mail. The horse carried two timpani drums, one on each side, which the drummer pounded upon alternately. Boom, diddy, boom, boom. I don't even own a sword, Reimer commented. That's an awful racket, Gorinda said. I'll soon put a stop to that. So saying, the giantess stooped to pick up a rock the size of Reimer's head. She reared back and flung it directly toward the army below. It sailed 200 yards straight out. Reimer watched it arc darkly through the sky. Then it fell nearly straight down. There was a clang as it met the drummer's black helmet, putting a considerable dent in it. The drum major fell forward across his horse's pommel, and the drums were silent. The Duke's ranks of men wavered and faltered a moment at this unexpected event, but they hardly slowed. There were shouted orders, and they continued marching. They were nearly to the bottom of the hill. At last, we'll have a little peace and quiet now, Gorinda said. Sir Grimjaw turned to Prince Joseph. My lord, when will you give the order to attack? He might have been inquiring what time the prince wanted dinner. Prince Joseph considered the ranks of men below. Well now, we have an excellent defensive position here. The enemy has the hill before them and the cliffs at their backs. The advantage is ours. We shall wait until they are halfway up the hill. I wouldn't know how to use a sword if I had one, Reimer said. They watched the army approach and begin their march up the hill. Some of the horses stumbled and slid in the snow as the slope became steeper, but they continued to advance. Reimer was about to suggest in a polite manner that they ought to turn and run, when Prince Joseph gave his sister a radiant smile. I think now, my dear sister, Swine Girl, or Princess Josephina, took a few steps backward and turned toward the tunnel entrance from which she and Gorinda had emerged. Thereupon, she placed two rather grimy fingers in her mouth, took a deep breath, and blew. What emerged was a shrieking, raucous whistle, most unbecoming a princess, Reimer thought. Then, from the tunnel entrance appeared Prince Joseph's army. First was a pounding, snarling brown shape the size of a wine vat, screaming, squealing, and stinking like an outhouse in hell, bowling down the hillside as if shot from a catapult, steam spouting from its nostrils. It was the largest, ugliest, meanest boar Reimer had ever seen. Actually, he had seen it once before. It was old Snarler. Close behind him, pounding at his heels, were 10 more boars, almost as large and ugly. Behind them were 20 more, then 40. Before Reimer could take in what was happening, a wave of swine were roaring down the hillside, all round where they stood, directly at the Duke's army. There were hundreds, no, it must be thousands of pigs, boars, sows, and even piglets, farm pigs and wild boars of the forest mixed together, all squealing, snarling, mean, angry, muddy, and stinking. They descended upon the Duke's army like a plague. The horsemen in the front rank tried to lower their lances, but the horses were terrified and rearing. The swine charged between the horses' legs into the ranks of foot soldiers behind them. Lancers were thrown from their horses. Pikemen, swordsmen, archers, all went down like ninepins. In moments, the Black Duke's army was thrown into chaos. Men in armor fell and could not rise. Some were trampled. Others, scrambling to get out of the way, slid over the cliff. The war was over in a few minutes. Prince Joseph strode down into the sorry mob below and found the Duke's war chief. He was a rather fat man named Sir Blunt, and at the moment he had a nasty 200-pound sow sitting on his chest. He was quite happy to surrender. Prince Joseph picked up the standard of Castle Stark, walked on into the castle, and that was that. Chapter the 8th, To the Ogre and Beyond. The events which ensued could make another history. Prince Joseph and Princess Josephina took Castle Stark into their care. As it turned out, a large number of the castle staff were secretly loyal to them and cheered their return. The Duke's henchmen and mercenaries mostly moved on to other places without complaints. The Black Duke himself was not seen again. Some said he had fallen over the cliff. Others claimed he had turned into a gray mist and floated away on the wind. Perhaps the gnomes knew more about it, but he was not heard of again in those parts. Reimer, though he was still anxious to be on his quest for Ariella, was forced to remain at Castle Stark until the first signs of spring and the melting of snow in the passes. He was an honored guest at the coronation of Prince Joseph, who of course became King Joseph. Vandor, the wizard, claimed he was too feeble to attend, but sent a chest of gold as a gift. Joseph used some of it to hire people to clean out the castle and have it repainted in bright blues and whites. Even the old tapestries and rugs got a thorough washing. Later, when spring was in the air and the first birds were seen, Sir Grimjaw was wed to Princess Josephina. Now thoroughly bathed and scrubbed and in a spotless gown, Rymer had to admit that she surely was the loveliest princess he had ever seen. Of course, she was no longer a princess, but a queen. Queen Josephina used the occasion of the wedding party to dub Rymer a knight. She had offered Gorinda the post of steward of Castle Stark, but she declined and chose to return to her farm, explaining, "Sorry, swine girl, I mean queen, but you could never expect me to live in these tiny rooms of yours." She went away, taking the pigs with her. Josephina may have been the only one sorry to see them depart. When at last the snow was melting and Rymer prepared to leave, Prince Grimjaw and Queen Josephina both came to see him. "Well, sorry to see you go, Sir Troubadour," the queen said, "though I know better than to try to persuade you otherwise. I hope you will return to us when your quest is finished. I would like to have you as court troubadour and hear you sing with Ariella." Rymer said he would find that delightful, but of course he would have to think about it after he had Ariella back. There's no predicting the future. Men make plans, but God decides. And that very morning, he set out on foot, carrying nothing, dressed in the same clothes he had arrived in. As he strode through the castle gate, he noticed a fellow in hand-me-down clothes sweeping the courtyard where the horses had passed. It was Sir Blackthorn. "I hope you're satisfied," the fellow sneered. "Look around. You've ruined everything." Rymer looked around. The castle glistened. Where the walls had been dark and menacing, all was whitewashed or painted in bright colors. Somewhere, a woman was singing. Merchants and travelers freely passed through the open gates. Spring was coming. "Twaddle," Sir Rymer said. The path wound steeply into the hills. The sun went down and a full moon rose, and still the troubadour climbed the path. High on the hill, he saw the glow of a candle in a window pane. It was long past sunset when he came up to the ogre's cabin. The cabin was old, built of logs with a sagging roof. Smoke rose from the chimney. Above the door was nailed a skull, and on the door itself someone had crudely lettered a sign, "Beware of ogre." Without stopping to think, the troubadour went up and knocked on the door. "Who?" a voice thundered from within. Then a moment later, the door creaked open. It was the ogre himself. The troubadour looked up at him and saw he was a very large, ugly man who smelled bad, but still only a man. "Mr. Argay?" Rymer inquired. "It's that little troubadour," a voice said from behind the false ogre. The one we robbed last year." At once, Rymer felt himself seized and dragged within. The two robbers were sitting at a crude table, drinking from a keg of mead. "Come back to retrieve your goods, have you?" one of the thugs chuckled. "Oh, no," Rymer replied. "You stole them fair and square, and you're entitled to them. I only came about Ariella." "What do you think?" the ogre asked his fellows. "Should we have this troubadour for dinner or save him for breakfast?" "Too scrawny for either," one of them replied. "Toss him in the soup pot." "Who's Ariella?" the other bandit asked. "My loot, of course," Rymer said, as if surprised at the question. "Your loot now?" the ogre scowled.
It's yours no longer. It's ours.
Oh, well, surely, Reimer said. I wasn't hoping to get her back. You stole her, so she's yours. I only wanted to make sure that before you sell her to someone else, you understand just how valuable she is. I wouldn't want you selling her for a mere silver coin or two. The ogre gave a sly grin at the robbers and tapped his head. He had just now realized the troubadour was quite daft. Then he sat down at the table and folded his arms across his ample belly.
And how valuable would that be now?
He asked. Reimer gave a shrug. I could show you better than I could tell. If I could just borrow her for a few minutes.
Why not?
The ogre made a sign at one of the two thugs, who shrugged in his turn. He went over to a chest at the corner and brought forth Ariella, handing it to the troubadour.
Sing us a song now,
Arge said.
Sing sweetly enough, and I may decide not to break you in two like a match.
Reimer smiled as if he had just received a compliment and began to tune. Just as Arge was beginning to scowl with impatience, the troubadour finished tuning, slipping a pick on his thumb, and struck a chord. The ogre's expression changed to one of surprise, for that one chord was perhaps the sweetest sound he had ever heard. For a moment, there was a profound stillness in the little cabin, save for the crackle of the fire in the hearth. The troubadour began to play. At first, he played without singing, a strange, lonely tune. The ogre's features began to relax. He took a sip of mead and closed his eyes. His two companions also drank more. Reimer had recognized the ogre's accent as coming from the eastern lands. He began to sing a love song of that country, a sad song of lost love. When the song was finished, no one moved, so he began another, even sadder than the first. The troubadour sang and sang. For a little time, Ariella's music seemed to transform the rude cabin to a lover's palace. He sang of lost princesses and princes who pined away with longing. He sang and sang. It was not long before the two bandits were sniffling in their mead, and even the ugly ogre squeezed tears from a bloodshot eye. The troubadour might have stopped to rest, but each time he paused, the ogre motioned for him to sing again, so he would begin a new song, or sometimes repeat one sung before in an even more mournful tone. The two bandits had traveled long that day and were tired and had drunk much mead. After a time, one of them put his head down on the table and began to snore. Soon, the other followed his friend's example. The troubadour sang a new song. They know him not, the folk in town. They know him not, but oft would frown at that lonely man of the mountains. Ah, that man of the lonely mountains. Ogre they call him, and worse say I, that man of the lonely mountains. Yet he can weep and he can cry, and wounded bleed like you and I, that lonely man of the mountains. There were more verses. By the time the song was finished, Arge was blubbering. He put his ugly, misshapen head down on the table and wept as no one ever had before, out of pure pity for himself. Weeping came up from the very center of him, racking his body and his whole being with a lifetime of pent-up pain, of exquisite agony. He wept and wept while Reimer and Ariella waited quietly. At last, when the ogre's sobs had somewhat abated and he could take a breath, he raised his head and looked wildly at the troubadour.
Enough,
he cried.
a man can take only so much of that music.
From somewhere, he brought out a sack of gold coins and tossed it to the troubadour, who caught it with one hand.
There's payment for your song. Take your loot and get out of my house before I eat you alive.
So the troubadour arose and without another word went out into the night. He arrived at the inn in the village in time for breakfast. The innkeeper, whose name was Weiner, was surprised to see him still alive and uneaten. Reimer paid in gold for meal and lodging. He ate well, then slept the day through in an upstairs room. Ariella cradled beside him. The troubadour came down at supper time. There were 3 or 4 other guests, so after dining, he played a few ballads for them at their asking. Then he told them of his experience with the ogre and the bandits. Well, Weiner said when he was done. The innkeeper stuffed tobacco in a clay pipe and lit it from the hearth. Well, you're a brave lad, then, either brave or desperate, to risk your life for a loot. He pointed at Ariella with the stem of his pipe. Why, I'll wager you'd better lost without her then. Why, you wouldn't know what to do. The troubadour stroked Ariella's strings and sent a chord aloft to heaven. He knew that Ariella's real beauty was not in her wood or her silver inlay or her strings, but in his own hands and in his heart. Ah, but then would she know what to do without me? He asked. He set the lute down to lean against the wall and began to sing without the instrument, a little ballad he had been composing in his head. Ariella, her name, oh, and her voice, her fame, oh, let her raise her soft song and set my heart aflame, oh. I should not imagine I would. He broke off the song and whirled to see a girl standing behind him. She was the most beautiful maid he had ever seen, even lovelier than the Queen of Stark. He tried to stammer a question, but found his tongue twisted in his mouth. I mean, I wouldn't know what to do without you, the girl said. She moved and placed an arm about his shoulder, as if to lean and see his face more clearly. That story you heard was all wrong, she said. Well, partly right and partly wrong at least. I never pined away and died for love. That was just a story made up to fool Sindar into thinking I was dead. The wizard only wanted to save me from having to marry King Sindar of Lothium. Wizard placed a spell upon me, which might be lifted only by one willing to risk his life to save me, and who would sing my name in a song. It was a fairy spell, and the little folk always like to impose conditions. Don't you know me, troubadour? I am Ariella. We shall not eavesdrop further on their conversation. After getting over his first shock, Reimer and Ariella talked long into the evening and night. They reckoned they were already married, since he had said so often enough. Yet they resolved to visit the chapel first thing in the morning to repeat their vows. Reimer told her of King Stark's offer to let him stay at the castle. No, she said, I'm accustomed to traveling with you. We shall travel on to distant lands, singing together. I can play a fairy harp, and you can get a new lute, one not enchanted. We shall sail across the seas, perhaps to Vinland or high Brazil. We may find vast treasure or terrible desolation, but we shall find them together. Men make plans, but God decides, he said. And so they traveled on. The end.